The American Revolution spans from the year 1775 until 1781, officially ending in 1783 with the Peace of Paris. Basically what we have here is hostilities between the American colonists along the east coast of what is today the United States, fighting against the British for independence. Now, the Enlightenment, as we talked about earlier in previous lectures and in class, was basically this idea, this movement called also known as the Age of Reason, that basically said that you can use reason to solve all of mankind's problems, including political problems. So what we have here for the first time are these enlightened ideas, these enlightened political ideas coming out for the first time and becoming a reality. So the American Revolution is really going to influence future political movements and revolutions in Europe, in Latin America, and all over the world. So it's really a turning point in history. Looking at North America in the early 1700s, we can see on the map here we've got three major powers contesting for dominance over the North American continent. The blue area is known as New France, and that basically takes up the modern-day areas of Quebec, Ontario, the Great Lakes region, and down the Mississippi River. So that whole interior region would be New France, with its capital of Quebec City. The area on the right of New France in the red are the 13 British colonies on the East Coast. This is in the modern day United States. And then we see also in orange Spain. So the Spanish Empire, by the time you get to the year 1700, was kind of in disarray. It was not the powerhouse that it once was. So basically it's going to come down to the French and the British as to who's going to dominate North America. And so if you see the area where New France and the 13 colonies border each other, like where it says Fort Duquesne on the map, these are going to be disputed territories all along there. So it's only going to be a matter of time before it really comes to blows between the two major powers in North America. One other major difference between the British colonies and the French colonies was that the British colonies on the East Coast were very heavily populated in comparison to New France. New France was very scattered. There were many different scattered forts and fur trading posts along the way, along the different river systems, but the population is scattered and it's not very permanent, with the exception of major cities like Montreal and Quebec City and New Orleans. But for the most part, it's a small population. Another major issue that we have here with the French is that if you look up to where the St. Lawrence River is, they have very limited access to the North Atlantic Ocean. So that's going to be an issue here later on, because the British Navy is going to use that to its advantage to choke the New France, basically when they do go to war. The French and Indian War, which starts in 1754 and lasts until 1763, was actually a smaller theater in the larger European conflict known as the 7 Years' War. So the 7 Years' War, by most historians, is considered to be one of the first world wars, and the fact that the French were fighting the British in Europe, the Caribbean, and North America. So there's many different theaters of this war. So the French and Indian War between the British and the French is for dominance of North America. And if you look at the map on the right, it all comes down to those borderlands I talked about. Now, Fort Pitt, or Fort Duquesne as the French are going to call it, was constructed along where the Allegheny and the Monongahela rivers meet to form the Ohio River. And whoever controls this area, this waterway, controls the interior of the continent. So the French are going to be the first to put up a fort there. This is going to make relations between the British and the French deteriorate, and it's going to lead to open conflict in North America, as well as other places around the world. There were some early French victories in upstate New York against the British forces, but eventually the British are going to be successful in using its superior firepower and population against New France. They take Fort Duquesne and establish Fort Pitt, where modern-day Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania is, and a series of British victories, most notably the capture of Quebec City in 1759, is eventually going to lead to a British victory in North America, in this theater of conflict. The Treaty of Paris of 1763, which officially ends the French and Indian War in North America, is going to result, if you look at the map on the left, of a complete British takeover of everything east of the Mississippi in North America. This includes the state of Florida, which was handed over by the Spanish as a result of the British taking Havana. So all of the eastern part of the continent falls under British control. And as we already talked about, the Spanish were kind of not a very great power at this time. So this just solidified British dominance over North America. So it was a pretty successful conflict for the British. After the French and Indian War, there were a number of unpopular moves by the British after 1763. One of the more unpopular demands put in by King George III was the line of proclamation of 1763 that you see here on the left. Now, basically, this line ran from Canada to southern Georgia, and it was proclaimed by King George III that the American colonists on the East Coast cannot settle west of that line, that the area west of that line was designated as kind of a reserve for the Native Americans that had helped the British in the war. So this was a pretty unpopular move by King George III because the American colonists were kind of hungry for new land and cheap land west of the Appalachian Mountains. On top of the proclamation line that was drawn up, the British Parliament is going to also increase taxation on the American colonists. Many people in Great Britain, many people in Parliament felt that, the Americans are benefiting very much from the British Empire, that the British Empire is providing protection, naval protection, military protection, and, they helped defend the Americans against the French in this war, and it was very expensive. Even though it was a victory for the British, it was a very expensive war. So there were many in Parliament who felt that the Americans should now kind of pull their own weight, that they should have to contribute to some degree economically and financially to the British Empire. They had it too good for too long. So in the 1760s, you're going to have a number of acts passed by Parliament which increased taxation on the American colonists. Now, the American colonists are going to feel that they can't be taxed without being represented in Parliament. That, they didn't hold any kind of representation in Parliament in London, so therefore they didn't have the right to tax them. But the Parliament's going to go ahead anyway with a series of taxes to increase revenue to help pay for, again, the French and Indian War. The Stamp Act of 1765 is one of the more famous ones. This is basically a stamp had to be affixed to legal documents, such as house deeds or marriage licenses or anything like that, showing that you paid a tax. The Townshend Act is going to place a tax on tea, lead, paint, glass, and other imports like that to the colonies. And this is going to be very unpopular, particularly in Boston, in New England. So you're going to have a number of people, especially in New England, boycott these certain goods. And a lot of the colonial legislatures are going to start petitioning to the crown to protest and to petition to repeal some of these revenue acts. It gets to the point where the British feel that, the revenue acts need to be enforced. And so they decide to send, a small number of British troops to more rebellious areas like Boston to make sure that, that the law is enforced, basically. So the troops being sent to cities like Boston are going to be very unpopular for a lot of the American colonists. Tensions are going to continue to be on the rise between Bostonians and the British, who are starting to occupy in larger numbers. This comes to violence in March of 1770, when you're going to have a number of British soldiers guarding the customs house in Boston come under assault from a mob of Bostonians. The Boston mob actually end up throwing snowballs with rocks at the British soldiers. They throw oyster shells at the British, and they're trying to, get a reaction out of them. And they did. And the British end up opening fire on this crowd, killing 5 of the Bostonians. It's called the Boston Massacre by history, but it was hardly a massacre, because only 5 people were killed. But as you can see in the picture, the engraving on the left here by Paul Revere, they're going to use the term Boston Massacre, or the Sons of Liberty will, as kind of a propaganda tool against the British. If you see in the engraving, guys, there's no indicator that, the crowd had provoked the British or had done anything wrong. They just are shown as kind of these innocent victims against a highly trained professional fighting force. Relations continue to get worse between the Bostonians and the British. The group, the Sons of Liberty, are going to push for political change, oftentimes using intimidation and violence against the British in Boston. The other famous act of protest by the Sons of Liberty was the Boston Tea Party in 1773. Basically what this was is you're going to have a group of Bostonians or people, the Sons of Liberty dressing up like Mohawk Indians and boarding 3 different vessels in Boston Harbor, breaking into the cargo holds and dumping the tea into Boston Harbor as a protest against the Tea Act and various other acts by Parliament. The result of the Boston Tea Party and the loss of all this tea is what we call the Intolerable Acts passed by Parliament, which were basically parliamentary acts that were put into place to punish Boston and Massachusetts. One of them was that the port of Boston was closed until all the tea was paid for. The colonial government of Massachusetts was reorganized. It was less democratic, and now it was more closely tied to the British Crown. So the British Crown had more control over the colony. You're going to have the Quartering Act, which makes it, legal you're expected to house British soldiers and troops that are on the move in Boston or anywhere else. So, relations just continue to deteriorate after the Boston Tea Party and the Intolerable Acts. Now, relations get so bad that by 1775, Boston's completely occupied by the British Army, and basically the countryside and all the villages around Boston are in rebellion. There's open militia that train, colonial militia. So the British are going to have orders to go and seize colonial caches of weapons in the town of Concord, which is 10 or so miles, 12 miles west of Boston. So the British Army marches with the idea that it's going to go to Concord and take these weapons from the colonial militia. So they leave Boston, and on the way they stop at the town of Lexington, which they're passing through. When the British force gets to Lexington, they're stopped by a colonial militia on Lexington Green. Then all of a sudden a shot rings out, but nobody knows exactly who shot first. It could have been a farmer, it could have been the British, it could have been the Americans. But the bottom line is, after the first shot rang out, shots are exchanged on both sides. The American militia, the colonial militia, break and run, and the British continue their march on Concord. All the while, the British Army is attacked from the woods, from fields, as the Americans kind of implement guerrilla tactics against the British. So the opening exchanges at Lexington and Concord and all the firing in between is considered to be the opening of hostilities between the 13 colonies and the British. So that's in April of 1775. So hostilities have started. Now the Americans are going to know that they can't depend on militia the whole time. So the Continental Congress is going to form the Continental Army, the colonial American army, to fight the British in open field if they could. They choose George Washington as commander-in-chief of this army. Reason being is because he's from Virginia, which is a way to kind of unify these colonies. They didn't want somebody from New England. They didn't want it to be just a New England struggle. So they get this Virginian in. He also has some military experience from the French and Indian War prior. It wasn't always the most successful military experience for Washington, but he had experience. So the Continental Army forms outside of Boston, and basically what you're going to have is the Americans occupying the area around Boston and the British occupying Boston itself. You're going to have what's known as the Battle of Bunker Hill fought, which was a British victory. They took the ground. The British took the ground, but at a tremendous cost. Many British soldiers were killed. But the Americans are going to put cannon on Dorchester Heights over Boston Harbor, which allows them to fire on the Royal Navy ships in Boston Harbor. So the British are going to decide that they're basically surrounded and they got to cut their losses. So they decide to leave Boston and let the Americans occupy the city. Now, by July of 1776, you're going to have independence from Great Britain officially being declared. Prior to this, there was a lot of American leaders who wanted to negotiate with the British, that they wanted to remain part of the British Empire. All they wanted was a certain amount of political autonomy, more rule at home, if you would. So there were many, even after Lexington and Concord, who were kind of unwilling to fully separate from Britain. So it's officially declared, independence is officially declared by the Continental Congress, the Second Continental Congress, in Philadelphia in 1776. So everybody that signed this document, or everybody that you see in the picture, in this kind of romanticized version of it, were committing treason. I mean, they knew that they were taking a big risk. If this revolution goes wrong, they could all be hung for it. The next phase of the American Revolution is during 1776. The British had basically abandoned Boston, left it to the Patriots, and they're going to have another plan in place, and that is to invade North America by taking New York City. And then they had another plan while this was going on, that they were going to invade from Quebec, Canada, and come down through upstate New York and link up between the two armies. So it was like a pronged strategy that they had in place. In 1776, you're going to have the New York campaign, where the British under General Howe are going to invade Long Island, New York. There on your left, you can see it on the map. And they're going to slowly advance along Long Island to Manhattan, pushing back the Americans inch by inch. And basically what you're going to have is George Washington and his Continental Army are basically surrounded on Manhattan, lower Manhattan, by the British. And George Washington is going to narrowly escape across the Hudson River with the majority of his army to fight another day. But the British do take New York City, and they're going to hold on to it for the rest of the war. Now, Washington and his Continental Army are going to basically have a Fabian strategy in New Jersey for a couple of years after they lost New York City. Basically what that means is that they are trying to avoid a pitched battle against the British. But George Washington's going to believe that the war cannot be won unless New York City is recaptured. So it's one of his goals throughout the wars to take New York City. But after that, he spends a lot of his time in New Jersey with his Continental Army, basically just surviving. Armies of the day were not very large, and this is a pre-industrial militaries. So, the Continental Army, at one point during its encampment at Valley Forge, winter encampment at Valley Forge, was about 4,000 men. So these weren't massive armies that we're talking about. But that was a major blow to the Americans, was the loss of New York City. Now, the other part of the plan was to invade from Canada. Now, the guy on the right, General John Burgoyne, oftentimes known as Gentleman Johnny, because he was a playwright, had a lot of different gentlemanly hobbies, used to have baggage trains just with his possessions and his wine and his fancy clothes. So he's a good example of a British general who rose through the ranks based on his connections through the aristocracy, not necessarily by any kind of ability. But his army invades from Canada, and it's halted by the Americans at the Battle of Saratoga. So at Saratoga, it's an American victory in 1777, and the British, for the first time in this war, lose an army. The entire army under General Burgoyne surrenders to the Americans. So what you're going to have here is kind of a back and forth going on with this northern campaign. during this war. Another blow to the Americans came with the fall of Philadelphia. The British felt that if they took the capital of the Continentals, that they would come closer to ending the war, but it didn't happen. Philadelphia falls, and the bottom line is that George Washington's Continental Army survives. The British are not able to capture it, so that's really the thing that keeps the war going up north. Now, the northern phase of the war is not necessarily going too well for the British. They wanted this war to end a little quicker than it was. By the time you get to the late 1770s, the French are now getting involved in the war. The French have obvious animosities against the British, going back hundreds of years. But more recently, obviously, the French lost the French and Indian War and really are looking to any chance to kind of thwart the British wherever they can. So they end up joining up with the Americans in their fight for independence against the British. And one of the main things that the Americans get out of this alliance is a navy. The United States Navy, formed in 1776, was pretty small. It couldn't stand up to the Royal Navy. It was involved in a lot of hit and run attacks against the British. Privateers were pretty popular. So with the French on our side, we now have an actual navy that can stand up to the British, and that's going to be really important here later on. Now, the British are going to change their strategy in 1779, 1780. And this is what we call the southern phase of the war. The British are going to have it in their head that the southern colonies like South Carolina, Georgia, are more loyal to the crown. And that if they can go down there and muster support and gain support from the colonials, then they can at least salvage those colonies. So we can cut our losses with New England, the British thought, but we should at least try to hold on to the southern colonies. Another major reason for that is they wanted cotton. This is the early Industrial Revolution, so the southern colonies were providing the British with a lot of their cotton at this time. So economically speaking, they didn't want to lose it. So what we're going to have is the British organizing under General Lord Cornwallis in the South to establish control over the area. An early American victory in the southern phase, the Battle of Kings Mountain, made it a reality for the British that it wasn't going to be an easy fight. The Americans were using a lot of militia along with regular soldiers to fight the British in the South. But it's going to go back and forth, basically. There's the Battle of the Waxhaws, also known as the Massacre at the Waxhaws, in which a large number of Americans tried to surrender to the British cavalry under Banastre Tarleton on the left there, and were just cut to pieces. So it becomes kind of a battle cry for the Americans, the Waxhaws. Remember the Waxhaws, and the brutal treatment that the British, most notably Tarleton, put on them. One of the worst disasters for the Americans was the Battle of Camden. The Battle of Camden resulted in the capture of about 4,000 Continental soldiers and militia by the British. The Americans, under the command of Horatio Gates, lost Camden, and it's going to result in basically the fall of Charleston, South Carolina, to the British. So that's kind of a major blow. But the Americans turn it around at the Battle of the Cowpens and the Battle of Guilford Courthouse, which turns out to be a draw. So basically we're going to have, after the Battle of the Cowpens, the Americans slowly pushing Cornwallis north. And this is by 1781. So everything happens pretty quickly in this southern phase. Now, Cornwallis is going to leave North Carolina and head towards Yorktown, Virginia. He's got it in his head that he's going to move to the coast of Virginia in order to acquire supplies from the Royal Navy. His army's running low on supplies, so he needs to be supplied. So he heads to the town of Yorktown, listed there on the map. The Americans are going to take this as an opportunity to kind of pen him in, surround him by all sides. And what you're going to have is George Washington and French General Rochambeau leave New York and head towards Virginia. At the same time, Nathaniel Greene is going to come up from the south, Lafayette, along with Washington, to basically surround the British on land. Now, the French finally are going to step in and really be a big help here as well. the French fleet is dispatched from the Caribbean and sails up the coast of the Americas and engages the British at what we call the Battle of the Capes outside Chesapeake Bay. It's a French naval victory. It's one of the few times in Royal Navy history that you have a loss, basically, in open water like this. So it's a rare thing in history. So after the Battle of the Capes, the French Navy sails into the Chesapeake and sails up to Yorktown, and from land and sea, the French and the Americans close in on Cornwallis. And basically what you're going to have is Cornwallis by October of 1781 surrendering to the French and the Americans. So what you have, guys, is basically the second major army to surrender to the American forces. Now, if the British really wanted to, they could have kept this war going. But we got to remember, there were people back in Britain who didn't support the war. There were politicians who didn't support the war. And to a lot of the British people at home, it was looking like it was becoming too costly. And it was dragging on too long. And so you're going to have a number of people in Britain pushing for peace, politicians pushing for peace. And it's going to be basically the end of the war. All right, so it ends in 1781, the hostilities, but the war doesn't officially end until 1783. Because negotiations have to take place between the British, the French, and the Americans. So communication and travel is very slow, so negotiations are going to take years. And all that while, Washington and his army are encamped in the field, waiting because they know at any moment the negotiations could break down and that the war is going to resume. So between 1781 and 1883, it's going to be a tense time for the Americans. Now, the Treaty of Paris of 1783 officially ends the war. And basically what you have here, guys, is the British recognizing American independence. So if you look on the map here, the area labeled United States is the newly formed country, east of the Mississippi, south of Canada. Florida, the British lose Florida, that goes back to Spain. And the Spanish get everything west of the Mississippi for the time being. So that's the major thing you get out of this. This movement, this enlightenment, is now really creating governments on the earth that are democratic ones. So we see that for the first time. So other countries like Haiti and different Latin American countries controlled by Spain are going to look to the American Revolution with enthusiasm that they could do this in their country. So it's going to have a tremendous impact and influence on other movements in North America. Now, the British recognized American independence. However, there's still going to be a number of border disputes between the British and the Americans, especially along Canada and in the Great Lakes region. And British troops are going to occupy a lot of these areas around the Great Lakes up until the end of the War of 1812. So basically, when we had the War of 1812 being fought, we're going to have a lot of the things that weren't settled with this peace treaty and weren't settled with the American independence get settled with the Treaty of Ghent, which ends the War of 1812. So basically here, guys, we see the American Revolution in action, what happened, what it impacted, and how it's going to impact the future of the world.